train here as a therapist and getting all the sessions recorded.
Yes, yes.
Is this an extra water bottle?
That one's for you there.
I might want a second, actually.
Oh.
Let me just go
I'm
get
a big
one.
water drinker. Well, no, because you don't have much left, so.
Oh.
Just have one sheet.
Hold. It will do.
Wet will do.
This this isn't cool. I'll put it
That's
down
fine.
here just
That's
in
fine.
case.
Sure, thank
If
you.
you need it. And
Do you get to edit this at all later on, or
Pardon?
does this get edited at all by you or anyone?
No.
This is it.
Basically, what they will do is they'll take the. It'll be transcribed,
Uh-huh.
and then you will have an opportunity to look at it to make sure that spellings were accurate,
Sure.
and you can edit it at that point
Sure.
if you wish.
I just have one other request, if possible. I'm short, and this seat isn't going to be. I don't know if maybe even just something that I could put behind my back.
do you need a cushion?
If a cushion is easy, but I can make something else work.
I have a back cushion if that helps.
That would help. It's just
specific.
that seat throws
Let
me
me-
back.
Mhm.
Let me just go get it.
I don't think I could. Yeah.
You need a little something more to
Uh-huh.
kind of
Yeah.
feel like you're in the chair.
Let me take a look here.
They must have made this exactly for my body type.
All right.
You know, 'cause it works very
Put on
well.
a sign. If you're ever ready to get rid of this was
Right.
designed for me. Okay.
So what I usually do is I ask about, background.
Try that first. Or would you prefer this rolled up?
Let me see. This is good.
Is that okay?
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Put that there. And I'll start this. What did I do? I went and took the doofer. Oh, there it is. Doofer. So, let me just double check you're in. Yes. You're in there. It has started.
Okay, and is this starting?
That one's going. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're good.
You're on you
You can
go.
be sealed in.
We are good, aren't we?
We are. So this is September the 5th, 2014. I'm Franklin Abbott. I'm speaking with Sarah Lopez today. And that's the basic information. So what I usually like to do is start with asking you about your family.
Okay.
Where your family was from, how your parents came together, where you
Wow.
were born, those kinds of things.
Okay. Well, I was born in Puerto Rico, and my parents met in Puerto Rico, and they, my father's family came from Spain, and then as a young man he moved to Puerto Rico, and my mother's mother was Spanish, although I think her mother lived in Puerto Rico. I mean, her grandmother lived in Puerto Rico, but her father was an Irishman who, Mr. King, who came to work in customs and met my grandmother. And my parents met at a dance, which is very fitting since I have kept that family tradition going, and I love to dance, and I'm probably the only one
Mhm.
of the descendants who does. And they lived in a very small town in Vega Baja, Vegabaja. And although my mother was from a larger town in Puerto Rico, and my mother had polio as a child, and had to wear a brace and was teased, and now we would say bullied in school. And so she left school, I think by the 5th grade she dropped out. And she was very, very handy with her hands, and she loved to sew and was very industrious. And so when she married my father, and they had 3 children together, and I was the youngest, she always wanted to be engaged in a business of making clothes and selling things and that kind of thing. And in Puerto Rico in the 40s, and mostly in the 40s, that was just not the appropriate thing for a woman to do. And patriarchy was quite strong, but not as strong as my mother. And And so she had to ask permission for everything. And my father, who was a good man, I have nothing, I mean, he was a product of the culture, but, you know, he could come and go as he wanted. And by the time I was 3, my mother decided to leave and took my brother and myself and my sister to New York City. And in a prior trip that my father was going to take, my mother insisted that she go with him. And during that time, she said she wanted to work to make some money to buy gifts for the kids, you know, for us when she returned, but actually she was going to see if she could work in a factory and support herself in New York, and she found out that she could. Because I was the youngest, in some ways the divorce and the move was the easiest for me. My sister, who was 10, had to start school not knowing any English and, you know, leave significant roots. But we first came and lived in a cold water flat in New York City and shared the toilet with the family next door. And so that was from 3 to 7. And then my mother remarried, and we moved up to Washington Heights in New York, which used to be a Jewish Italian neighborhood. And now it's very Dominican, but it was quite different when I was there. And lived there until I was 15. And then we moved to Arizona.
Arizona.
Yeah, Tucson.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that
And I did not want to go.
3 big hops.
Yeah. I was very interested in theater and worked off Broadway as an apprentice in high school. And it's like, you can't take me away from New York. And but I really loved it. And in New York, I would spend some part of summers in Puerto Rico in a little town, and then in the city. And I think that's part of my being able to maneuver among different groups and be comfortable in lots of different settings. And I didn't want to be Puerto Rican, so I also know about that kind of internalized shame. There weren't, that I knew of, any, I mean, Carmen Miranda was sort of it in terms of role models in this culture. And so when I would go to a new neighborhood to meet guys, I would take my mom's maiden name, which was King, and I'd be Sally King and just drop that Lopez, because I got tired of hearing, oh, you don't look Puerto Rican. You know? And when I moved to Tucson, my English teacher introduced me as the only Puerto Rican from New York City with a British accent. So at that time, I think I've lost it completely, but at that time it was like, I don't want to be Puerto Rican, I don't want to have a New York accent. And but I think in Tucson I came home to myself.
How did that happen?
Even though my mother remarried, my stepfather was not I mean, he was supportive, but he wasn't a strong, nurturing figure. And I remember as a teenager getting into an argument with him and his saying, well, you should be a lawyer because you win every argument. And so there wasn't that affirmation from a male figure. And my father had remarried and had 6 more children. Because of the ease, I think, in which I moved in and out of different places, when I got to Tucson mid-junior year, I was very popular and got elected to student council the next year, and then received this, it was a Catholic co-ed school, and I had received it was like the May procession, where one senior girl was identified as the Blessed Mother, and then another was identified as her, her attendant, and then each class had, the May attendant, and so I was, selected as the May attendant, and at one level it really surprised me because I hadn't been the most, at one level very spiritual and very good student, hard worker. At another, I think it's me, I could say as a first generation, but I felt that I wanted things that didn't come naturally. So I had done some cheating in school, and finally got that I was really cheating myself, and so, and fortunately for myself, never got caught. I had done some shoplifting as a teenager. I had smoked in New York City, you know, and I got to Tucson, and I was like, this is totally wholesome environment, and only certain girls smoked and all this stuff. And also I'd gone, this was my 4th high school.
Wow.
I'd gone to a very kind of elite Catholic girls' school where I lived with my cousin out in Long Island, and I didn't like it. And then I went to a Catholic girls' high school in New York City with very, very strict Italian nuns, and I didn't like it. And then we were going to move the next year, and my parents agreed to let me go to just the public high school for the semester, and I did. So this was also my 4th high school.
Wow.
And so there was a priest who was the dean of men, a Carmelite priest, and he also taught religion. And when the announcement was made about who was selected, he said it couldn't have happened to a nicer person. And it was just that being seen, even idealized in a way, but at least someone recognizing me. While prior to that, all my teachers were females, and until he died last year, we remained friends.
Wow.
Yeah, and he became a psychologist. I think he became a psychologist after I had first gone to graduate school, but before I had actually gotten my degree, and ended up becoming the Director General of the Carmelite Orders, Priests and Nuns internationally, and was just an incredible human being that I was blessed to have crossed my path.
So you went to Catholic schools, and Catholicism was a big part of your life. Can you talk about that?
Sure.
Your religious development.
Because it certainly is connected to my sitting here today. I did go to Catholic schools, and you know, my mother, well, when we first moved, you know, downtown, I went to Catholic school, and my mother, I was 1st grade, my mother enrolled me, etc. But as a 2nd grader, in preparing for Holy Communion, and you know, just learning about the commandments and the laws of the church and that kind of thing, as a young child, I was taught that divorce was not allowed, and it was a mortal sin, and you couldn't receive the sacraments if you were divorced, and of course you couldn't go to heaven if you hadn't received the sacrament. You know, so it was that kind of sentence, and so I would be going to Catholic schools and very much spiritually oriented, and yet my mother wasn't allowed to receive the sacraments, and I was being told that my parents were going to go to hell. So at a very early age, I knew there was something very good about religion and teachings and values, and there was something twisted because in my own thinking, it couldn't be heaven if my parents were going to be there.
Mm-hmm.
So I had done this separating out from just being a believer, you know, complete believer. And then when we moved, I went to public school, but went to religious education afterwards.
Okay.
And I look back with amusement now at myself, because after one of the religious education classes at the public school, I walked into the principal's office and said, "And why can't I come to school here?" And I guess because it's a parish school, you know, they had limits. But anyways, she made a place for me in the school. So I finished my elementary school at a Catholic school.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was kind of a lot of spunk for.
I know. I mean, I look
kid.
back at someone in, as I say, I think I would have been maybe 6th grade,
Mm-hmm.
and I knew what I wanted, and that has been pretty true for me much of my life, fortunately.
So you finished high school. Where did you go to college?
So in high school, so in Arizona there was some college day and that kind of thing, and also vocation days. So there was the element of, was I going to enter the convent because I was spiritually inclined, or was I going to go to college? And I was the first generation of my immediate siblings and my stepsisters. My stepfather had two stepsisters. They had gone to they had taken some college courses. I don't think either of them graduated. And I was also interested in travel because I'd been traveling since I was 3, getting on planes. And so one of the colleges that came on campus was Marymount College, which then was in Palos Verdes Estates. And I was drawn to it because it was one of the first colleges in the U.S. to have junior year abroad program, because the nuns had convents in Spain and in France and in London. And so they could send their college students over to study in those countries and have them be safe. So that appealed to me, and then it was on a hill overlooking the ocean, and that appealed to me. But I was really torn. I'd been accepted to enter the convent, and I'd been I hadn't yet been. I'd applied to Marymount, but the only way I could go would be with full scholarship and a whole financial package. And at one time, the religious director said to me, "Well, it can be God's will if you get availability through Marymount. Perhaps that's the right choice, or if not, you can come with us." And when I got the scholarship, she said, "Well, it could be the act of the devil." And again, that was another one of those aha moments, what's wrong with this picture? And so I decided to go to college.
And what was that like? What was your college experience like?
It was, again, having children and grandchildren, I recognized that it wasn't necessarily the norm. Having visited campuses the year before with my son and taken them to school, etc. But I took a Greyhound bus from Tucson to LA and got picked up by a big sister. And I am pretty adaptable. There were, I remember particularly one young woman whose parents came and helped. We had beautiful rooms because Marymount was started as colleges for diplomats' daughters and that kind of thing. So it was a very nice place to go, and it was only 300 students, and so it's not like now where you have to find your own bedding and all. But these parents came and they were really helping the daughter, and I thought, oh, wouldn't that be nice to have that kind of support? But I fit in pretty well. I was co-president of the freshman class. I remember we had screening tests, and 8 of us got pulled out. I thought, oh my God, I failed it, because again, I felt like I was entering a new level of competition, and I had been selected for the honors program. Which was a blessing and a curse. It was the first year they were having this honors program, and it was really intense. And I did work study, and so I was working 10 hours a week, and but it was also great. I had some wonderful teachers, and I think there too there was a little bit of the. It seems like a side, but again, I think in terms of where we end up, it's relevant. The president of the college was a woman. I had a male philosophy professor, but most of the faculty administrators, they were all women. So at one level, is a wonderful role model. And but the Archbishop in Los Angeles was Cardinal McIntyre, who's one of the most conservative, restrictive cardinals in the church. So again, there was that contrast of being glad. I had to take religion and philosophy every semester. It was required. Glad I did. But there was also, again, that contrast between the good and the gifts and the dangers and the limitations and restrictions.
So what did you major in? How did you move from college into the world?
Okay. I was going to, because I still was interested in drama, I was going to be English drama, but there was no drama department. There were plays and stuff that I participated in, but not an actual department. And then I took philosophy, and I really loved it and tutored philosophy. So I was going to be a philosophy major, and then I took my first psychology course and knew that was it, and never questioned it. And in fact, I've just given an honor to my mentor who taught that course, and we're still friends to the university. And so I always wanted to do my junior year abroad, and as people who know me, they're not surprised, but I was co-chair freshman year. Because it was such a small school, I was a student body social chairperson my second year. So I organized the mixers and all that kind of stuff. And Loyola University was a brother school. And so we would have meetings with the women's colleges and the men at Loyola University to plan mixers and stuff. And it was there that I learned about Loyola Chicago just having started a junior year abroad program in Rome. So through Marymount, I could have gone to London, France, or Spain. But because I was so interested in religion and the Vatican Council was going on, I decided to go to Rome. And but I couldn't afford to go to Rome because my scholarship and work study and all of that wouldn't transfer. So my parents wanted to go to Europe, and my stepfather was on a pension and had Social Security, so they rented their house in Tucson. And I went to live with them in Rome that year.
Wow.
And when we moved to Tucson, my parents had never driven because of spending their adult lives in New York City. So at 15, I became the family chauffeur. And when we moved to Rome, we bought a VW Bug, and then I drove us around Europe. But part of my motivation, or a strong part of my motivation to choose Italy, was spirituality. And I remember going one time to the Vatican to see the Pope, to St. Peter's, and I was shocked that there was like all this, everybody pushing and elbowing each other to get closer. I was like, wait a minute, this isn't what I came for. And I stopped at this little gift shop outside of St. Peter's Square, and there was this Catholic American nun there. And, oh, what are you doing here, etc. So I said, I came to study, and but I haven't really gotten what I came for. Even though it was a Jesuit university, and I was still having religion and classes and philosophy. And she said, well, you should try a retreat. There's a place outside of Rome near the Pope's summer home called Castel Gandolfo, and they offer international retreats, and they have them in English. And it's called a Center for a Better World. So I looked into it, and now I look back, and I don't know how I looked into it, because there wasn't internet, there wasn't, but it was like, somehow I found out about when the English retreat was going to be, and I asked the director of the program if I could take a week off school to go to this retreat. He said no. So I went anyways, and that's where I met my husband.
Wow.
So again, it's just, I have been reinforced, I would say gifted and reinforced in listening to my inner voice, and it was a life-altering experience. And I decided that it was such a powerful experience and it wouldn't be available to the other students. So I wanted to give them a sampler or a taste of it. So on campus I created what I called a Day of Recollection, and had the nun who led there was a priest and a nun who led the retreat. The priest I was not wanting to have more contact with, but the nun was incredible. And so I had her and some of the priests. It was about 30 or 40 people, and except for a woman who was in her 50s and considered herself a religious, I was the only lay person there. They were all priests, brothers, nuns, seminarians, and it was pretty shocking. Like, what did I get myself into at 20?
Mm-hmm.
To be the only lay person there. But it was really, almost like a encounter group experience where we sat around in a circle and people shared, and very, very powerful. So in planning the Day of Recollection for the students, that was part of getting to know, because my husband Frank Ostrowski, Frank a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
I'd fallen in love with him at first sight, but knew that wasn't, in 66, priest did not leave the church, and I wasn't interested in having him leave the church. But so when we had a little bit of contact, not a lot, and then I came back from my senior year in college, and it was in my senior year in college that this same nun, who was my mentor, got me a work-study position working with autistic children. And among the interesting circles of life, it was I had to drive about 40 minutes each way, but it was at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica, and that's where my 8.5-month granddaughter was just born.
Wow.
So
a very interesting circle.
Yeah. So I went from Marymount, coming back, graduating, and that was a hard year for me. And I guess it's probably as close as I get to the being closeted experience, because I came back to a small college, all women and nuns, etc., and my secret was that I was in love with a Catholic priest. Wow. So I was like holding this forbidden secret. Mm-hmm. And also I knew it wasn't going to go anywhere, so it wasn't like there was correspondence, but it was this, I'm hurting, I'm stirred, and I can't talk to anybody about it. And I also got depressed that year. Mm-hmm. And the same mentor one day saw me and she said, looks like you have smiling depression. And I had never heard that expression before, but I was certainly raised and taught to have a smile on my face. So she was pretty perceptive that way as well. And she had gotten her doctorate from Catholic University. I had, the nun who hired me at St. John's, she knew when they had been in graduate school together at Catholic University. So after college, I ended up starting a doctoral program at Catholic U.
But you didn't finish your doctorate there?
No, I was there for a semester, and prior, I think the summer before graduate school, I'd gotten a letter from Frank that he was leaving the priesthood, and he had fallen in love with a young German woman. So like that, I was moving forward, starting my doctoral program, etc. And then friends of mine who knew him said you might want to get in touch with him again, because he was down at the University of Florida in the doctoral program there after he left. It looks like the engagement fell through. So I got back in touch with him, and we corresponded just a little bit, and then he said that I was too young, and his former fiance was early, it was around 20, 21 as well, and he was 37, and that he was going to pursue a relationship with a nun he had met in England at a retreat that he had offered, of the same kind of retreat. So I really was like, enough already, goodbye. Mm-hmm. So that Christmas, I was going to go back to Tucson to be with my family, and I was going to afford to go there by working on an Indian campus with a faculty member who was doing research, and that fell through in terms of timing. So I ended up driving to my aunt's house in New York instead from Washington. There's one quick story which is significant just because of the women's movement, and that is that I went out on a blind date, a friend of someone who I was in graduate school with, and so we're having dinner at a tavern on the Green, and he says to me, "Oh, so you're in graduate school, aren't you afraid that you're really not going to find a husband if you get your doctorate?" And I said, never occurred to me. That wasn't in my considerations as I was, considering my career. And the next day, I get a call from Frank, and he wanted to come up and see me. And I wasn't very encouraging of that at all because I need to go back and do my exams, and I'd already, it's like enough already. And he persisted, so I said, okay, you can come up. And so he came up to see me, and I came back to my aunt's house that night, and she said, well, how was it? I said, it was wonderful. I think he's going to ask me to marry him tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, really? And I had asked what she thought of him because she had met him briefly, and she said, well, he's very nice, but he's too old. Not now, but later, because there was a 15-and-a-half-year age difference. So the next night he asked me to marry him, and I said yes, and drove down to D.C. where his family was celebrating the holidays, met them, and he came up to see me, I think on the 27th of December, and we were married January 6th in Florida, and had to have all the blood work, and it was New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, so I mean, it might have happened even faster. So the funny part is that I heard from my graduate student friend that when he heard that I had gotten married a few days after he had made that comment, he thought that maybe I had gotten scared. So, and at that point, because Frank was so much older than I was, and he was in Florida, and I was in D.C., it didn't make sense for me to finish graduate school there. And this was pre-women's movement. This was 1968. And it was like, well, one PhD in the family's enough. And so I was pregnant the next month, mm-hmm. and had 2 children. And he got his doctorate. And it was really after our children were a little bit older that I had the sense that they really didn't need the amount of energy that I had to give to life, that I decided to go to school. And Frank had done his internship from the University of Florida at the Georgia Mental Health Institute. So it's where we met various faculty members at Georgia State, like Irma Shepard and Joan Fagan, Bernard Kempler, and Earl Brown. And Catholic U wasn't a Catholic psychology, mm-hmm. but it was very much mind, body, spirit. Mm-hmm. The University of Florida, the program that Frank was in, was very much behaviorist and rat studies. And when I first applied to graduate school, I thought, a PhD is a PhD. When I got the contrast, and I couldn't stay in Florida. I couldn't say we were because there wasn't a doctoral program there, so we were going to have to move somewhere. So I knew I needed to find a program that was humanistic or integrative. Mm-hmm. And that's when we moved to Atlanta.
All right. So one of the things you told me before, that a motivator for you to come to Atlanta was to study with Irma Shepard.
Yeah, and that was another, I have been, my relationship with life and the circles of it have been stunning. And I say that because I didn't want to leave Atlanta. And I remember being at Phidippides and talking to this stranger, and she said, well, wherever your husband goes, that's where you want to go. And I'm like, I love my husband, but I still don't want to move. I still don't want to leave Atlanta. And during that year of 1970, Evening at Emory offered a class on the women's movement. And that was my first exposure to the women's movement. And while growing up, I had wanted to shed Lopez because I didn't want to be Puerto Rican, I didn't want to be Latina. Having a last name of Ostrowski wasn't much better. Oh, you're Polish. No, I'm not Polish, I'm Polish. So in 1970, when we moved to Florida, I went back and took my maiden name. Mm-hmm. And pretty controversial. And I remember my kids were under 3 at the time, and the National Women's Political Caucus was meeting in Florida 4 days away. And again, I felt like I got to go there. And but conflicted, because I thought, what if I have an accident, on the road, and I've just abandoned my children because something is telling me that I need to go there. And so I did, and it was marvelous. I mean, Gloria Steinem, and just all the big names were there, and the early beginning of the women's movement. And so when I came back to the Cape Kennedy area, Merritt Island, I became founding president of Brevard Women's Political Caucus.
All right.
And we boycotted the Florida Women's Club at the beach with picket signs and everything because they had a white-only policy. I cut ribbons from a govern, carrying my baby in the center, and was on the board of ACLU, and it turned out that legally I couldn't get my driver's license in my maiden name. So ACLU was going to fight that. And they researched it, and Texas had ruled that a state could require a woman to use her husband's name on a driver's license. And I was written up in the paper about, this in a very by a very wonderful woman reporter who published a very becoming picture of myself and my children and Frank, and the story of my caring about people and
Right.
getting involved. But I saw the whole array of pictures that were taken, and I thought, oh, just one picture, slightly different energy in a conversation, and the whole story could have taken such a different slant. So it really gave me an appreciation of the power.
Mm-hmm.
And it also gave me appreciation of vulnerability. I gave a talk one time to the Kiwanis Club. It was all men's group. And I remember showing up with this other woman, and I've never been a strident feminist. I always believe that it's equal rights, not women having power over men or any of that. So whatever I said was not particularly radical or extreme at all. And there was one man there who was with his daughter, and so they came up to talk to me at the end, and I was thinking, isn't this wonderful that he's bringing his daughter? And then he laid into me. And I was another Betty Friedan and one of those, women, and then his daughter says, yes, and I like having the doors open for me. And I just started crying. I was so taken aback, so blindsided. And again, I think in terms of, in part, I'm here because of my work with gays and HIV/AIDS and sexual orientation. That was another time where you think you are just speaking your truth and for a good purpose, and someone's fear or belief system gets thrown at you in a hostile way.
Yeah. So you came to Atlanta to do your doctorate. What were some of the highlights of that process?
I chose Georgia State, and for people who didn't know about the psychotherapy program at Georgia State, it was considered to be one of the best in the country. And so, the faculty in terms of Irma and Joan and Earl and Pauline, the faculty were just so wonderful, dedicated to psychotherapy. And my first ethics paper, which is when I first met Earl Brown, who's a mutual mentor of ours, he said, the way to pick the topic is to figure out what gets your juices going. And again, that has been my advice for anything in life. And so I actually did my ethics paper on social activism in psychotherapy, the importance of social activism for psychologists, that we shouldn't be just picking up the pieces of the harm that's been done by society. But yes, we need to do that work to help heal the harm, but we also need to alter the systems that do the harm. I was very fortunate that I got to work in the clinic at Georgia State, and then after my internship at Grady, that I also got to coordinate the clinic for a couple of years. And during that time, get to choose whatever supervisors I wanted that were available for free for 2 years. And it was a very enriching and rewarding experience.
And from there you went into private practice.
And from there I went straight into private practice. Yeah. Now,
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, because of my values, my ideal self would have gone into public service in some ways. But my year at Emory, great, it was through Emory, but my year at Grady, it was like what gets my juices flowing in terms of the kind of therapy that evokes me and that I think is really what I'm good at. It would be hard to do it in most systems. And so by going into private practice, I could have some say of how I worked. And it was made easier in that Frank had already been in private practice.
What year was that?
1981.
1981. So it was probably right around that time that you and I met, that maybe through AAP or some other kind of something professional, because there was a lot of overlap. And it was right in that period of time that the beginnings of the AIDS epidemic was, it just was, we were just getting some intimations of it.
And I was just going to say, in terms of Georgia State, there was the incredible emphasis on quality therapy. But an important mentor of mine, and a friend of yours, would be Pauline Clance, who was the one who represented the social justice and empowering women and speaking out and those kinds of things. And she was definitely formative in that regard, and is still a dear friend, and
Still a standard bearer.
Absolutely.
So you took all of that into your private practice, and then one of the areas that you began working in very early was HIV/AIDS. Yeah,
before doing that, and I am bilingual, so I never really saw anyone speaking Spanish. I saw a Latino client, but not anyone in Spanish while at Georgia State. But at Grady, through Emory Rehab, that was the first time that I was actually pulled in because I was Spanish speaking. And of course then the population here, the proportions were smaller. But I was involved, before HIV work, I was involved with the Division for Women Psychologists and chaired that division. And then also Frank and I co-chaired the Psychologists for Social Responsibility, which was an anti-nuclear war group.
Okay.
So, you know, again, there were elements of weaving that in. But my first experience of anyone with AIDS, I mean, I did have gay lesbian friends, but more probably lesbian friends, but I went on a wilderness workshop called Heart, Wisdom, and Courage, and I talk about all of this in the article that I wrote for the American Academy. But at that workshop, a 2-week wilderness workshop with high ropes and vision quest of being alone with just water, there was a man from Atlanta who had full-blown AIDS. And so I met him there, but he was still, he had AIDS, I guess not full-blown because he was AIDS, but he was still healthy enough. Although, and he was just so full of life. And then when he came back to Atlanta, he started getting sicker. And then Frank and I would cook for him, and Frank and my son, sometimes I would deliver meals to him. And Jeff was the first contact that I had with somebody with AIDS. And then also he chose the final exit in the end. And I worked on his quilt for the AIDS quilt, the AIDS project, with 2 gay friends of his. So that was my first step into having a personal impact. And I think I had one. Well, I've always worked around sexual orientation issues and spirituality and that kind of thing. I had one young widower who had just lost his partner. So that was like not just reading it in the papers, but having this having it be more personal. And then in 1990 is really when I got involved. And that's where David Wood's fellow, my colleague, had, on his internship, he had done hospice work in California, and he had worked with folks who were HIV positive. And I had supervised him before, and then we were becoming colleagues and had never actually worked together and wanted to do something together. And that's where we thought about doing a group for folks who are HIV positive.
And that was a long-running group.
We stopped it, last year. It was 22 years. We started it at Grady Hospital. There was no infectious disease program. He and I went down to Grady and just said, would you like us to provide a free group? And they had one social worker there at the time, and it was like, sure. So we would go down to Grady once a week and do the group there, but they just could not give us the facilities that were appropriate for group therapy. We kept on having people come in, being bumped, and finally we just said, no, we're going to take this to our practice, although it would have been nice for people to have had that one stop.
And all during that time you were raising your sons?
When I started in private practice, my kids were teenagers. And so both graduate school was actually a very good thing in terms of parenting, because when they were little, I could study after they went to bed. When they were older, they'd be studying too. So it really, and I could be home for dinner every night, and except for one course that started at 7 a.m, I would, be there before until they left for school, and so it was actually
a fairly normal experience.
Yeah. Although when I was in graduate school, there was initially, straight out of college, there was a woman who was pregnant, and it was like, how can you do that? I mean, I'm just consumed by this task of just being a graduate student. How can anybody be married? How can anybody, but we all learn how to adapt when it's needed.
Yeah.
And to me, I found it to be actually very enriching, because one of the things I realized was that, whether an exam went well, whether whatever hurdle I was working on was frustrating, or dissertation or whatever, I'd come home to kids who loved me and hugged me, and so there was a very nice balance, and a husband. And I did, the other thing that I was involved pre the HIV work was I did my dissertation, I did my dissertation on battered women.
Okay.
And during my internship, a friend, Karen Schwartz, and I did a group for battered women. And then Frank started with another man the first nonprofit for abusive males. And then eventually those incorporation papers got turned over to Men Stopping Violence.
Oh, wow. So that's interesting how that it kind of seeded that.
Right.
So you're through your practice, you were involved in many different things, and the forms of social activism varied, but there was always that element of social activism, that was part of what you did.
Yeah.
And something you shared with Frank as well.
Right. And the other part of social activism I was just thinking of a little bit was with Latinos, and during the Cuban boat lift. There was no Latin American Association. There was no Hispanic Health Coalition at the time.
Right.
There was a Catholic nun, Sister Barbara, and a few other people who were looking at some of the social issues, St. Joseph's Mercy. So I was doing a little bit of social activism around that.
So to go back to your Catholicism, obviously, one way that you broke from the formal Catholic Church was to marry a former Catholic priest, and that puts you on a different path. And I know that one of the things that has been also, of huge importance to you and to your work has been a spiritual practice that has integrated belief systems and practices from many different traditions. Can you talk about how that sort of came into being and how that has flowed?
Well, first of all, I think Jiminy Cricket's "Let Your Conscience Be Your Guide." For me, it's "Let Your Heart Be Your Guide." And so for me, even though Frank and I would be excommunicated by getting married, I knew what he would talk about, it, that there's a spirit of the law and the letter of the law. And that for me, spirituality has always been about love, not about judgment. So there was never a question of would I marry him, because I knew, I just knew that for someone who wants to be married, and I'm thinking, of priests who were leaving, or people who were leaving, to say, no, you made a commitment, so you just, live this way for the rest of your life when your heart's no longer there, or yourself. It just was wrong to me. So I didn't have any qualms about breaking the law of the church. And Frank had been in the process of going for, it's not an element, it's called laicization. I mean, in the church there's that piece of, he wants a priest in the order of Melchizedek, you know, you're it, you can't undo it.
Mm-hmm.
But there also was a process in the church called laicization where people could apply to be released from their orders. And but in the past it looks like it hardly ever happened. And then in 67, 68, 69, I mean, we got married January of 68. So very early on, suddenly more and more people were making that choice. And I think in part as an understandable delay tactic. And also it was new to the Vatican. It's sort of like, what do you do, et cetera. There was, it's like you put your request in, but it's, you know, kind of into the void, and you never know, is it going to be granted, when is it granted, et cetera. So even though Frank had started that process of laicization, we had made a decision to not delay getting married, waiting for that to come in,
Right.
which then would have allowed us to remain good Catholics, et cetera. So we were married twice in a civil ceremony, I mean, a justice of the peace, and then a former priest who had married us in more of a religious, spiritual setting in his home. There were people who did not accept it. My family, fortunately, did not, you know, make a big deal about it. Two of Frank's aunts were saying, okay, how do we respond to this invitation? And one went to a priest, and the priest said, well, you ignore it. You know, he knows what he's doing, and he shouldn't have done it, and you're certainly not going to acknowledge it. And they lived with that for a while, didn't feel okay with it, and they went to another one, and that priest said, well, of course you should acknowledge it. You know? So I think people were struggling just again, like with be it gay marriages, or there's a change happening, and when you've believed one thing all your life about right and wrong, what do you do with that? I had none of my two mentors, even though they were in the religious life, never had any, you know, question about it. And Frank's a mentor, but a college classmate said, "I'm sorry, I can't have contact with you." And later on, years later, came around and said, "Sorry, didn't know better." And so when we were, I think I was about 6 months pregnant with our firstborn, Jim, who was named after a Catholic bishop, who at the time was a Catholic bishop. He then became the first bishop to leave years later, but we didn't know that. When I was 6 months pregnant with Jim, we got a phone call being told that we could get married in the church. But there were certain stipulations, and the stipulations were not acceptable to us. And so we said thanks, but no thanks. But we would still go to church. We would still be nominally Catholic. There was the underground movement, and churches and homes and that kind of thing. And then when our son was born, there was a whole question of, well, do we baptize him? And what Frank and I decided to do was to write our own baptismal ceremony, because neither of us believed in the stain of sin that a child is born with, and needing to remove that. It was more of a blessing. So we wrote our own ceremony.
Wow.
So our children would go to church with us some, never went to religious education of any kind, at one point, when they were teenagers, weren't particularly wanting to go. Frank wasn't wanting to go. I was the only one, because I love ritual. And So finally I said, I do not want anyone going with me that doesn't want to go. I'll go, I'll go by myself, but I sure don't want to feel anyone being dragged to going. But I certainly wouldn't go, every Sunday or that kind of thing. And then neither of our children are religious. Michael, who just had a little baby, I sent him the baptismal dress my mother made to him and his wife, and I said, this is just to give it to you as a legacy. This is not any
You don't have to use it
any
for that.
pressure in any way of my knowing, what you should be doing. Then Frank went through a period of being anti-religious, which I could never get with personally, because some of my dearest friends were still, in the religious life, and to me it wasn't, is somebody celibate or not, or some self-identify. It's where's their heart, where's their soul, and so I really, there's a Holly Near song that I will misquote terribly, but it's something like, I'm not afraid of your God or your Jesus or your Allah. I'm afraid of what you do in the name of your God. And that has been my ambivalent relationship around religion.
Okay.
And at times my family has been very involved, in speaking in tongues, and which were not part of the old Catholic Church, but were part of the a later wave, but that never seemed to get in the way of the personal connection.
So how did you begin to incorporate other kinds of spiritual paths? What led you there?
Sure. Well, I have loved yoga since my children were little. And during one of the visits to Arizona, and I've never been disciplined, so it's not like I'm a real practitioner, but whenever I do it, I love it. My stepsister, who is very religious, had said, "Oh, that's the work of the devil." I was like, "Okay, thank you very much. I know it's good. I know it helps my spirit." So I think first it was yoga. And I think then for 17 years, Frank and I had a study group at our home for the Course in Miracles. And Dave McDonald was a part of that for those 17 years. And so we had a weekly group. So that was certainly one alternate Christian tradition, but certainly very, very different. And we had a Jewish friend whose parents were Holocaust survivors be a part of it as well, even though it's the voice of Jesus. But as people who have studied it and respond to it can sense that there's a wisdom there that is more profound. I studied with Hilary Ehlers, a local psychic, and Frank and I had actually gone to her in Florida before she moved to Atlanta. A therapist in Atlanta, kind of recruited her to come here. But I had heard about her, and we went to her before she moved here, before I applied to Georgia State. And she was telling me I was going to be moving to a place that was very, very green, etc. So when I came to Georgia State for my interview, it's like, well, you may not know that I'm coming here, but chances are good that I am. I've never been, it's not like, some people have left the Catholic Church and become Episcopalian because a priest can marry, or I really just don't have the need. I don't have the need for a spiritual community because I have that. In Buddhism, where they talk about the Sangha. I've done dance meditation, or ecstatic dancing, and that was a group that would meet once or twice a week. I have a different group now that does improv, that also feels very spirit creative. I helped a friend of mine start Water Moon Refuge which is an urban center for stillness, Swami Lotus.
Mm-hmm.
And so I meditate there twice a week. And then right now I have a meditation group that meets at my house. It's mostly Emory people. So I have meeting places, but for me, almost every human encounter is sacred.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like I have this need of, okay, now Sunday mornings, and
Right.
it just isn't there for me. And I'm not opposed to it. It just isn't there for me. And
Great.
Also, I was going to the Omega Institute because a friend of mine, Robert Gass, he and his wife created Heart, Wisdom, and Courage, opening the heart workshops, and just a very, very spirit-filled man, and his music. And so I started going to Omega every summer, initially to take a workshop with him, and then to
Mm-hmm.
help Robert and his wife Judith Ansara do week-long couples retreats. And it's couples retreats as a spiritual path. But at one of those meetings, I met a Buddhist monk from Sri Lanka, whom you've met, Bhante Vimala, and that was, I think, perhaps my first introduction to Buddhism. I mean, I would think that that probably started with Bhante, and he was writing a book, and he asked Frank and I to edit it because his English wasn't too great, and so for me, what I really believe in are the wisdom teachings. That, not to simplify, here's universal everything, but does truth resonate or not?
Yeah, yeah. How has that impacted your work? Can you talk about a little bit about how your spiritual awareness informs your psychotherapy practice?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know that I have ever, I've never gone for pastoral counseling or to be a spiritual director or anything like that. It's always just been a part of who I am. And Ray Craddock at Georgia State with Jungian work, certainly Jung's, I'm not a Jungian, although I practice with 2 Jungian therapists, but I do go to lectures of the Jung Society, and that whole, again, that broad, cross-cultural honoring
Yes.
of different traditions and teachings, and the same thing, Joseph Campbell. The way that I work is really to just share whatever comes through me to be shared, with the censor of, is it just because I'm wanting to say something, or is it really going to be appropriate? The therapeutic abstinence, is it really going to be helpful or meaningful? And and whenever I do, if I say something, I always say, it may be from this tradition or that tradition, but I'm not advocating that tradition. Like here is this possibility or facet to consider. I certainly have worked with people around this 12-step program and see that as an incredible spiritual tradition, and was not at all surprised when that was identified as someone identified it as the most significant spiritual movement of the 20th century, and I believe that because I've just seen lives transformed profoundly. It was really with the HIV group where for around the first 10 years it was more of a therapy support group, and then it shifted, and David and I referred to it as psychotherapy spirituality group. And that's where, from the get-go, people would, what does this mean? What I would say, once I got clear about what does it mean for me, is it's Christian quote, but the glory of God is a human being fully alive.
Mm.
And I would say that that informs my life and my work. Where is their deadness? Where is their constriction? Where is their fear? And one of the things I loved about yoga is they talk about flexibility and strength. And, it's like when I say, where is their constriction? It's not because sometimes people need to harness in. And it's not just, let's let go of limits,
Mm-hmm.
But where is spirit absent, or life force absent?
Your orientation of being, of paying attention to that kind of energy, whether it is in, a teaching setting or a therapy setting or just in living your life, how did that affect you as a parent?
Well, hopefully my kids are living proof. I think that they are both so very different,
Mm-hmm.
and so going for their aliveness.
So you
And
can,
each
you
of
can
them-
see that. In their
Each of
path.
them. I mean, my one son, who was the engineer and had a doctorate in engineering and taught at Penn and got tenure, and said, "It's not what I want. I'm going to quit." And my other son, who's a TV writer now, he had working for a documentary company, and was in a meeting, and somebody said, "I wish I'd left this job 10 years ago." And he calls us up. He says, "I don't want to be that person."
Very interesting.
So I think that it's the air they breathe. I think Frank, as died at 79 and had last 5 years with cancer, and was still representing the Fellowship of UN, the Fellowship of Reconciliation at the UN, going to Paris to give a talk on truth and reconciliation, going to meetings in Japan and Israel. And so I think that it's not an accident that we met at a retreat at a Center for a Better World.
Mm-hmm.
And
And that's been the theme.
that's been the theme, and I wanted to continue
Yeah.
to be the theme.
Well, talk a little bit about Frank. How spirit and social activism, informed your relationship, what the journey was like together, and what it was like to live with him while he was going through cancer. You're a cancer survivor yourself, and, losing him.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if we would have stayed together if it had not been for my sense of trusting my knowing. And I think he'd probably say the same things. I mean, I don't think it's being grandiose on my part. I think understandably, Frank, he never dated. He had wanted to be a priest. Yeah, I think he went to. I think there's one picture of a dance that he went to, but that was it. I mean, he wanted to be a priest since a child, and was in Catholic St. Paul. And that was like the top of the mountain, and that's really what he wanted. And then when he was giving that up, there certainly was an unmooring. And so when we first got married, and then I got pregnant a month later, he went through a period of, oh my God, what have I done? Now I can't. now she's pregnant,
Mhm.
And so there was a period of time, I think, where he got depressed and was questioning, what am I getting into, becoming a father? This, like he never envisioned this for himself, that kind of father. And what's true is he was an incredible father. I mean, from changing diapers and, he really, he was in graduate school, but he was one of these people that's able to say, okay, work's done at the end of the day, I'm home. And so, he was really a very good father. And his mother was she wouldn't define herself as a feminist, but she went to college in the 20s, graduated from college, and she and her college classmate started a restaurant in a bank building, and it was unheard of. And an article was written in the paper about these two young college students who were, so he was raised by a businesswoman, wonderful, nurturing, fabulous woman, but who had her career.
Right.
So even though I was at home with the kids, and at one level that made his life easier, when I wanted to go back to school, he was like, you need to. You've got gifts, you need to get the training, absolutely. And he left a job he loved, a part of the country he loved, and moved very willingly here to take a new job and to support the family while I was in school. I think that there were at times struggles in terms of I think he fell into the marriage. That didn't work out. Okay, well, she's still over here. I'll go, in 2 days. So it wasn't like we really had a long courtship of his deciding, yes, she is the one that I really want, and doing some of the healing work of leaving the priesthood. And that played itself out later. So through some of the work that I did, despite our being in practice together, when our kids left, I chose to separate. And then 6 months later, I was diagnosed with cancer. And he was very willing to come back. And I said, no, I'm not returning because of fear. What I need to face this cancer diagnosis is what is really life-giving for me. And I took life on as my lover, and had, fortunately, because both of us are so people-oriented, had an incredible connection. And during the 2 years of separation, we continued working together. We continued having the Course in Miracles group meet at our house, although he was living elsewhere. But it was a very important time, I think, for him to decide what he wanted, and I wasn't even at what do I want. I mean, it's like how do I stay alive? It's like, do I want to go date somebody else, or do I want a divorce or whatever? It's like, no, I just want to do, again, I went on vision quests and just a number of different things. And then at the end of those 2 years, I think at one point he was wanting to come back, and because if anything happened to me, he wanted to take care of me. And I said, not good enough. I'm not planning to get sick. And then later on, he really wanted to be married to me. And that's when we got back together.
Okay.
Curiously, because you were asking about the impact on our kids about this living life, my daughter-in-law has said that our separation was harder on her than it was on either of our sons. And part of it is she came from a very traumatic family background, and so our idealized couple was, just so meant so much to her. But I think both our sons were like, go for your life. We'd like you to be together. And again, we weren't destructive with each other, tearing each other down or anything.
Right.
So it was like, we're living our life, you lived yours. And certainly they were very, very glad when we got back together. And,
Yeah.
but that sense of, just like we trusted them, you know, I don't know where the term originated, the daimon, D-A-E-M-O-n.
Right. I don't
You
know.
know,
where it
but it's
came
like that
from.
inner being evoked. I think that's what we encouraged in them, and then that they could support that in us.
Okay. How long were you all back together before he got his diagnosis?
18 years.
Okay. So a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
So sort of like a second marriage.
It was like a second, yeah. I mean, our first marriage was raising the kids because, you know, it's like our firstborn was born before we had our first anniversary. And they went off to college, we separated, and then, yeah.
Came back together.
Yeah. Yeah, and really, you know, it's like, again, I think it's in that theme, if you will, that I told Frank, I said, I don't, because he had considered going into the Peace Corps while we were separated, you know, different things. I said, I don't care what you do. You know, I mean, it's like, if you want to go to the Peace Corps for a couple of years, that is fine with me. I would rather know that your heart is with me and you're halfway around the world than are living together and not feeling connected. There was a period of time where he was retiring, and I had a client suicide, and I needed time off, and I really didn't think I'd be going back to practice. And we took a month to South Africa, we took a month to New Zealand and Australia, we went to, you know, did lots of traveling, and envisioned our life continuing that way, probably. And then he was invited to represent the Fellowship of Reconciliation of the UN. And all of a sudden, every month he's going to New York, going right on the street past the building where the tie factory that my mother worked at, and then he's going to, you know, a meeting in Japan, or he's going to a meeting in India. And so, you know, some of the travel he did on his own, but yeah, that was, and I went to China to help a friend adopt a baby, and we did a lot of traveling together, but it was not it's never been you need to take care of me, you can't do what you want to do. I mean, neither of us are high maintenance that way.
Right, right. You were both very independent.
Yeah. And also enjoy family and being together, you know. So, in terms of, so by the time he was diagnosed, it was really, it was a good prognosis, thymic cancer. They were going to do the surgery, and then, you know, it's the kind of cancer that doesn't recur, et cetera, no chemo needed. We were going to do a family trip. It was going to be my 60th and his 75th birthday. And so we were going to do a family trip to Greece. And then this came up. And we canceled the trip, and instead, on the day we were going to be in Greece, we went to Athens, Georgia, and the day we were going to be in Rome, we went to Rome, Georgia, and the day we were going to be in Belgium, we ate Belgian chocolate. So you know, it's like, how do you get creative with what life brings you? But during the surgery, they damaged part of his diaphragm, so he had a little bit more trouble breathing, but not terribly so. He stopped playing soccer when we had played soccer together, but he was still traveling the world and still going to New York. And then it was about 2.5 years into that the radiologist missed a smaller tumor. And then the 3 months later, when it was found, he went through chemo, and but the disease wasn't what they call was never resolved. And so, but even during much of that time, the chemo was pretty rough. But during much of that time, keep living life fully. And for me, in some ways, the thought of losing him was eased by having lived alone for 2 years. Because otherwise I would have gone straight from college, a little bit of graduate school, never lived independently, to being alone for the first time in my life. So those 2 years is like, okay, I know that I can have a full life and be happy and not have Frank as my partner. So that was one part. He made it so easy by being so willing to have people come in, late when to have people come in and sit with him if I needed to go do something. It wasn't like, well, no, I want this person but not that person, or it was just like it was really one. People loved him, so people wanted to be there, and living with the uncertainty. I mean, when I was diagnosed, and again, in terms of HIV, this is one of the things that I write about, and also that we all learn, is Castaneda's statement of the spiritual warrior lives with death on his left shoulder. We're just in denial about our mortality. And so, yes, a cancer diagnosis makes it more front and center, but our mortality is still, part of the human condition. And there were 2 times, one when we were celebrating our 42nd anniversary, and he said, I don't know if there'll be a 43rd. And this was January 6th, and he died on the 25th. So, he was really, even though that day he had given a talk to a book club about his book, and had driven back and forth from Rome, Georgia, so it's like, but it's all just that holding all of it. And I said, well, we didn't know if there'd be a 41st or a 40th, and so we just keep moving forward. And what became easiest for me was when I realized that it was all about love. So it wasn't like, well, if Frank's going to live, then I'm going to be this way, and if Frank's going to die, then I'm going to be that way. No, it's like, how do I love today? What does loving today look like? And I have my compass. So it didn't have that whole roller coaster. And then also he read everything on near-death experiences. I still have a bookshelf of all the things that I've written about life after life, all that kind of stuff. And he was really ready. Either way, he was ready to live as fully as he could any day, and he wasn't scared of dying. And he also ended up writing a spiritual autobiography, and left a folder, which I didn't know about until later, of how he wanted his service and everything. So there was a sense of completion, and there was a sense of incredible love around us and between us.
Yeah. And he's been gone for how many years now?
2010.
2010.
January 2010, so about 4.5.
How has it been different for you? I know that you say that, your internal compass of loving the day, regardless of where you are and with whom you're with, has remained the same. But how has life been different?
Well, he's definitely still with me. And but not in any way that feels limiting. You know, I mean, I've heard people say, well, you know, I could never get married because, no, I mean, he's with me in a light way.
Mm-hmm.
I've got half the team,
Mm-hmm.
as I've told my kids and as I know. And even though I lived alone for 2 years, you know, I was 20 years younger.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly there are times it's like, oh, this is a little harder now. I think I have done some dating, and dating at this age is really as exciting as it's ever been, and as weird as dating could probably be.
Mm-hmm.
I celebrate my freedom, and I've had one housemate that's temporary. I'm getting another housemate that I'm really excited about, you know. But I'm going to a friend's funeral or memorial service tomorrow, and how many, you know, as you know, how many of them have there been lately? So I think it's Frank's death, it's friends' deaths, peers.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm 68. I'll be 69 in a couple of months. So mortality is present, and intentionality of going for the most,
Mm-hmm.
both in, you know, maximizing health, and I was diagnosed with cancer a few years ago, and I'm doing well, and you dance a dance.
Yeah.
Keep finding the music.
I like that. Well, of all that we've talked about, lots of different things. Are there areas that we haven't visited that feel important to you?
Well, I had perhaps falsely thought this was mostly going to be about my work around HIV. So at one level, you know, there's a lot that we haven't
Mm-hmm.
visited. I had never anticipated it would be as personal,
Mm-hmm.
except when I should have considered the interviewer.
Well, you know, certainly, you know, we can go back and do more with the HIV, but I think that for me at least, that it's really important, and at least as important, if not more important, to know who you are.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
and to have your story.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's part of your legacy is your story, and you have a fascinating
Mm-hmm.
story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I knew pieces of it, but not all of it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that's quite a movie.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else you want to say about your HIV work?
Well, it drew me to places I wouldn't have necessarily have gone. And I don't mean that just, you know, kind of emotionally, or anyone who works with dying, that kind of thing. Because of my work, I was asked to write an article for Voices. I don't consider myself, well, I considered myself a writer before a master's and a thesis, and after that it was like, forget it, I never. But it really, it's like, oh, I can write. And then, you know, it's the second time where an article has been written about me, about me and David. Not because I'm looking for publicity, but just because someone is recognizing something that I was doing. I was I was invited to join Positive Impact, and the AIDS Mental Health Agency, and I presumed it was because I'd been doing this group and somehow they had heard about it, because this was really totally independent, and we started before PI existed, and I didn't know if it was because I was Latina and they wanted a Latina board member and such, but part of Julia Strong, who was one of the founding board members, part of what she was committed to was it being an agency dedicated to diversity, but not just serving diversity, but living diversity. So it was the first board. I'd been to board meetings before, but I'd never been to board meetings before where the board is dealing with each other about issues of diversity,
Mm-hmm.
and like really doing the work of it. And I had done I had done leadership before, but then I was asked to chair the board, and I had not chaired a nonprofit board of that caliber and size. And then during the time that I took off around healing from my client's suicide, there was the Latino, it was the HIV initially, white gay disease,
Mm-hmm.
then African American, but then Latinos were not being served and were showing up positive. And then what do we do about that? So I agreed to consult, just at a very reasonable fee, to Positive Impact to create their Latino outreach program. And then I created maybe half a dozen trainings, bringing people like from the New York Aids coming here and doing AIDS work, AIDS training for Spanish-speaking therapists, doing the trainings in Spanish for therapists. And so it was one of the first times that I'd ever have to, I can talk with clients in Spanish, but it's another thing to talk in front of a group in Spanish.
Right.
And so they were like these, just saying, the next step, the next right step was something else that was new territory. And then hiring, then now Positive Impact has its own Spanish-speaking therapists and such, but being part of that initially, and then meeting other different leaders around the HIV community here, and then being invited to be on their cultural diversity faculty.
Mm-hmm.
And again, primarily as doing Latino issues, and then eventually where I was learning more and more about oppression, and realizing that for gays and lesbians and others, that religion is a source of oppression. And then that's when I started doing panels on spirituality and sexual orientation. So, it really, that work changed the group to realizing, Dave and I really were wanting this to be a spirituality group, and then bringing spiritual teachers from the community into the group. And so there was just a lot of growth that happened. That isn't why I initially said yes.
Mm-hmm.
And getting, being at an AIDS funeral and getting clear that no, I'm not willing to be affiliated with a church whose values I can't agree with. So it changed me.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's, being a therapist, it's a reciprocal relationship.
Sure.
But certainly the movement responding to the epidemic was life-altering for me.
Well, certainly, part of your legacy here is just what you were talking about, that, not only were you a pioneer in terms of, groups that addressed, the psychological needs of people living with HIV, but also the spiritual needs, and then bringing your, social activist self into the mix, to advocate for Latino people to get equivalent services and be taken seriously. All of that is quite a gift.
Yeah, and I really must say that Paul Plate gets the credit. Do you know what I mean? He's the one who was seeing the problem, getting the grants, and then making it happen. Tapping me. I wasn't the voice saying, "Hey, folks, you need to address this."
Right. But you were there to help.
Yeah, absolutely.
and probably as a resource, just simply because of your life experience, your professional background, and your spiritual orientation's the wrong word, but just the spirit that you embody, that you were able to positive impact's kind of it's a play on words. You were able to make quite a positive impact there.
Well, and I think when David and I started that group, we thought maybe a year, because everybody it was a death sentence. A friend of mine who was high up at CDC around HIV. When I was telling him what I was doing, he said 5 years max for anyone. And from early on, people were dying. So it's like, is this group just going to implode, die off, and then the rest of it just implode? And then 22 years later, we reluctantly decided to stop. The group didn't want us to stop, but again, just the aging, the aging process, expecting a third grandchild, other things, I knew that it was time. But we kept going, not out of discipline, not out of obligation. It just was life-giving and it was meaningful to us and rewarding to us. And I'm just so grateful to have supported those who were in the group, to have been with those who didn't make it, and to have such wonderful, the allies. One of the things I did in preparation for this was just, and I don't know if it's needed or not, but just, who are all the people that were, that was part of our team? It's like the spirituality piece. They were panels, because everyone had such incredible both stories and the learnings.
Well, one of the things that is sort of missing piece that archivists have identified in their study and collection of information on HIV/AIDS is the role of the caregivers. From the scientist, who did the work, to the people like you and David and Paul who were on the front line, providing the services. We have a lot of information about, people who lived with and died from HIV, and we certainly, know a fair amount. The politics is public record, but what hasn't been, studied, is that network of people who addressed the physical and psychological and spiritual needs. Yeah. And so your list is very valuable because more people can come and sit in that chair and talk. Absolutely. And maybe that's part of what you can trade places with me and talk with some of them, because you know their story better than I do. Yeah. You were there and you know some of the people who made an important contribution, and I just think that story is extremely important to tell.
And when you asked earlier, were the things that I hadn't touched on, one of them is that I did not know this, but in doing the work around HIV, then I have two half-brothers who died of HIV. But because of language and separation, it's like I really hardly knew them. But one of them was a scientist in the States who I tried to connect with, and then there was a mix-up and it didn't happen. I'm not sure what that was about, but he ended up going back to Puerto Rico to die. But he was gay and, was very educated and making contribution. The other half-brother was a drug addict, and got infected that way and died. So it was, one of the things that I had concluded about that is that we're all impacted, by AIDS, and it's not like, well, because I live in this little area, it doesn't impact me, and so it feels right in an additional way, but a very thin line.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm glad that I can make a difference in people's lives, and I miss the group.
Yeah.
We met every week, and I think there was the time between doing the group as a therapy support group and changing it to be a spirituality group. There were a number of months where we took a hiatus, and part of it was around people were going back to the Lazarus syndrome. People were going back to work. A daytime group wasn't optimal. I don't think David and I, neither of us really wanted to consider changing the time. And so when we changed the group to something that was still lively for us, some of the group members continued, because for the 22 years we had one group member, one continuous group member. But it was such a touchstone. And you mentioned about the caregivers. One of the things that I did also, and I can't remember how I did it, except maybe, I can't remember how I sponsored it, but Robert Gass and Judith Ansara were doing the Opening the Heart work, and he had worked in a hospice, and so they were doing some workshops for caregivers. And I just trying to remember if it was pre-positive impact or not, but I invited them to come and do a day-long workshop for caregivers. And that is one of the areas that was so neglected. Mm-hmm. And I think Paul and Leslie Brogan were probably two of the people locally who really did some of that tending.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll get them in here. Is there anything else you want to say?
I don't think so. I think no, I just am very grateful for this opportunity, and it's just interesting that what I put as the center of just my organizational notes was being evoked mm-hmm. by suffering and partnership. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting, even though we didn't cover a lot of the things I thought we were going to cover, how that theme of being evoked held true.
Yeah. Well, thanks.
Yeah.
I don't know how to turn anything off. But
okay. We can walk away from it,
we
right?
We can. I just have to let them know.
Yeah.
What will happen is that, the wheels grind slowly here, but at some point a transcript will be available for you to look at. And they will preserve both the audio and the video. Uh-huh. So that'll be part of the archive here.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm glad for that.
Yeah. So
let me see if I can find more.
Yeah.
She's going to have a deed of gift for you, because you had some things you were going to give her.
Yeah. Oh, great. Oh.
Did you have a wonderful time?
Yeah, it wasn't anything like what I had anticipated, but this is fine.
Congratulations, you're one of our
Official.
yeah. Very happy you did it. Let's see, I'm gonna turn this off. Almost off. Okay. And I'm going to